would propose they absolutely believe that their explanation is accurate. From their perspective, from their point of view, that's the only thing they could have done. And they're telling you, this is the only thing I could have done. And then it's up to your judgment and your expectation and your possible annoyances that say, you could have done something else. It was your idea, as I understand. So how would you phrase it? How would you state it?
The difference between excuses and explanations. Well, I was just thinking about how when we're kids and somebody's like, why'd you do that? And you start to explain it to them and they're like, no, don't give me any excuses. And as far as explanations are what happened. And it's not necessarily an excuse. An excuse is possibly a justification for an action, and the explanation is, and the excuse and the explanation can be the same thing, but an explanation isn't necessarily an excuse. That's how I would basically explain it, but we talked a little bit more about that, into that.
So the definition of an excuse and an explanation.
Right.
Those have to have different definitions.
Right. So the explanation is the circumstances around the action or why the action happened. An excuse would just be the justification for the action. Now that varies, that's subjective. But as far as an excuse is obviously something that it's an explanation for the action, but a justifiable explanation for the action.
Okay. Which one do you want to start with?
I think we should start with excuses.
Excuse. What is an excuse? So let's clearly define an excuse.
Well, I think that's a bit subjective because people have different levels of what, or culturally or whatever, what they decide is justifiable. So that depends on the person.
So when would you give an excuse?
If there was, like, for instance, you're late for a meeting and there was nothing you could do about it, the situations that happened, you'd say, well, I tried to get here on time, but I got hit by a car, whatever. That would be an excuse because you made a promise or made a commitment. And but that's still up to the person that you're telling it to decide whether that's justifiable or not.
So to go to the end, you use the word promise. How does that relate to excuses?
So I would think that it doesn't matter to the other person whether, unless there was an expectation involved, whether you have an excuse or an explanation. I think a promise or some sort of expectation would have to be involved for them to be interested in it. Unless they just want to know, like, what happened with your day. You're sharing an event between the two of you.
But that wouldn't be an excuse because
you would need an excuse.
You haven't let anyone down.
Yeah. Oh, unless they just were like, that was something weird that you did. Why'd you do that?
I wonder, are we sure that excuse is negative and explanation is positive?
No, and I think that's a big problem because that's especially That's especially used with kids a lot, where they're like, like I said before, there's no excuses for that or whatever. And so it gets a negative connotation. But obviously there's situations that can't be helped.
I have something you could edit in about making an excuse. And I'm so sad because I can't give the exact prophet, but I think it was Spencer W Kimball. And he said he always tried to serve his neighbor and he had neglected a need at his next door neighbor, and he went over and he said, sorry, I wasn't here to help you, but we had chicken for dinner that night. And the idea was that no matter, and excuse is just an excuse, it's completely doesn't matter to the other person. You could say anything to be your excuse.
That's true.
So it doesn't have any, you could say whatever excuse you want, you still neglected to be there for the other person, or we're not at a meeting, or, there are things that happen and I think that's the difference, maybe.
But I think that goes back to promises and trustworthiness. So I think it's a test of trustworthiness and whether, so if you were just like, we had chicken, that's like, instead of like, oh, my child was sick or something, like, I meant to help you, but it couldn't, stuff came up that I couldn't, be able to do that. Now, if it was just neglect, like, well, I was supposed to help you, but I didn't feel like it or I didn't think about it, then I think honesty is important there too. Because if you're trying to form good relationships with people, I mean, I guess if you don't care. So I think either way, honesty is important if you're trying to form trust and be a trustworthy person. And that goes back to promises and expectations. As far as whether excuses can be positive, I mean, there's probably times where, as far as boundaries and circumstances, where you need to make an excuse and you have a legitimate excuse, and it's like, I'm sorry, I can't do that. Or, something else came up.
Well, is an excuse always, I'm sorry, I can't? Or is an excuse, I love you?
I mean...
Is that an excuse too?
But I would see that more as a boundary. So an excuse is, this isn't something I can do, and this is why. And sorry.
Maybe we do have a problem. Houston, we have a problem. Did you hear 7? He said, we have a problem. I don't know what I can eat for lunch.
So would that be an excuse? Or is it an explanation? I don't know what to eat for lunch. It's a problem. It's just a problem. It's not either excuse or an explanation. So it's a situation.
And he knows he's not supposed to come in, but it's a problem. He has a problem. I think that is...
And so he explained it with, I don't know what to eat for lunch. Does that have the possibility of getting you upset or not getting you upset? I mean, you mentioned he was 7. Why does he's 7 matter at all?
Because he's just a little boy.
Yeah. Why does it matter that he's 7? Is a 7-year-old supposed to know what? Is there an expectation that a 7-year-old will know what to get for lunch?
No,
it depends.
Wouldn't.
I don't know. It depends on the child. Because in general, he knows what to get for lunch. But he's decided there's 12 kids here, and he's decided he's completely lost, which is can be an expectation because he's overwhelmed with 1 billion people in the house. But as far as me expecting him, yes and no, because of circumstances.
Was that negative?
No.
Was it negative that he didn't know what to get to eat?
I mean, it was negative for him, but for me, no. I mean, a little bit. I'm in the middle of doing something, but
a little annoying.
Yeah.
But wasn't it a little bit funny as well? We laughed about it.
Yeah, well, of course.
So it's a little bit funny. So it's not that it's an excuse or it's not annoying necessarily.
Well, I mean, him coming to find me and the fact that he's overwhelmed is an excuse. If he was in general didn't have issues with that sort of thing and was just trying to get my attention for whatever reason, I mean, I guess that could be considered an excuse too if he felt lonely or whatever, or wanted to know what we were doing. But what I guess an excuse would be that, like I said, it's subjective for the person. So an excuse for me with him coming and doing that, if I didn't mind him coming in, that would be an acceptable excuse. But if I expected him, back to expectations and promises, to go do something else, and he already knew he wasn't supposed to be coming in here, him just wanting my attention for whatever reason would not necessarily be an excuse.
Well, it would still be not an acceptable excuse.
No, that's my point.
In his perspective, let's just go to as a 7-year-old. Was he giving an excuse or an explanation?
When he was telling me he needed help finding food, or
right.
That would be an explanation because there were no negative feelings involved. Like he didn't think he was going to get in trouble. So
because he does want
But it's also, I think it's back to expectations, because even though I told him that he needed to go do something else, he knows that if he knocks on the door, I'm not going to just scream at him or whatever. So he feels he can give an explanation instead of an excuse, I think.
Do we commonly try to make excuses or give explanations? What's our...
As human beings, I think it depends on the person and how they have grown up in circumstances they have been in.
Okay, try to give an example. Okay, you're saying all this is subjective, and we used an actual example. I like to use an actual example there. So
I don't know.
subjective is fine. We're okay if we're
Right.
dealing with subjective stuff. It is all subjective, and that's
Yes.
what I want to get to is where does the excuse come from, anyway?
Or needing it, or feeling like we need to do an excuse.
To
Is
say
that
it.
what you're saying? I think
Yeah.
it's because we want something out of the situation, whether for them to not be upset with us or whether for them, like I said, it comes back to relationships, I think, and trying to build trust in a relationship, or just trying to, if you're lying about it, trying to get out of something, once again, that might make them upset and break trust in our relationship. So I think that's where excuses come from, or needing an excuse. It's like,
So does the person giving the excuse care about the trust of the relationship?
I would say so, because otherwise, why would they make an excuse? Unless it's not in good faith and they just want something out of the relationship and doesn't care whether they're actually trustworthy. I mean, they still care whether the other person trusts them, but they don't care whether it's a mutual trust situation, because they're just trying to, like, they're not trying to better the relationship. It's just they want something out of it. And I would think more short term, because eventually that's going to be found out, like if you're lying about your absence or whatever, so that you don't get in trouble at work or whatever you're going to get in trouble at. But if that's a continued thing, it's going to be found out anyways. But yeah, I think it's trying to form trust or show trust.
That's ironic that you would maybe make up an excuse that was not true
But people do.
in order to form trust. And I'm not being critical of you. I'm just saying, isn't that ironic?
That's an interesting, yeah.
Being ironic, can it be done? Can it be done effectively? Do we know of anyone who's done that effectively?
Well, but we have all kinds of, if we're talking about like serial killers, I was reading stuff on
Okay.
Ted Bundy, and he, of course, he went out of his way to go into situations, like he was on the rape hotline and went into, like, I think it was it Republican political parties, and he was very active in that and very active in a lot of things. Although he sounded like he was completely crazy otherwise anyways. I wasn't there, I didn't know him, but as far as the things I read about him, he obviously went out of his way to put himself in situations to make it seem like he wasn't doing the things he was doing, and that's sort of an excuse.
Not telling the truth about what you are actually doing, what your ends.
Well, that would be making a false excuse if you're going out of your way to portray yourself or tell somebody that you did something or didn't do something that you did do.
Okay, so a lie.
Yeah, so a lie can be an excuse, obviously, or used as an excuse. I wouldn't necessarily, I don't know if it would be necessarily a true excuse, like a truthful excuse, obviously, because the other person is, again, rating whether they feel like it's justifiable for them. But it's obviously they've used it as an excuse, and it's not in good faith or truthful explanations or excuse. In this case, they're using the explanation for the excuse.
Okay, let's try something. Let's try something here. So each of us, start with this. Identify what an excuse. Why we would use an excuse, a situation, and why you'd use an excuse, and then maybe why it would lie. How you could lie to use an excuse.
Yeah. So if I'm slowing down thinking about this, I'm going to use excuse in a different way. So we're talking about giving excuses, right? But what an excuse is, it's used to excuse our behavior in a situation. Okay. So I'm giving excuses. I'm excusing my behavior. If I'm giving explanations, I'm explaining my behavior. So you could say excusing is to like, I'm guiltless. I'm going to blame something else for this situation. I have no responsibility in this. That's my excuse. I'm excusing what I did or what happened because there was nothing I could have done. And if I'm explaining it, then I'm taking responsibility, and I'm perhaps like, well, here's the explanation of behind why this happened, and also I'm responsible for this. And like maybe you could even go further and say, this is how I'm going to fix it. This is what's going to be different next time, or this is, of course, I'm to blame in this situation. I'm responsible. So I think that's the clear difference for me between excuse and explanation is are you taking responsibility for your behavior, or are you trying to be like, I'm innocent, I'm a victim in this whole thing too, and then you're giving excuses.
So I agree with that, but I also think as far as the trust relationship goes, you can give an explanation just to be like, well, this is how it is, and not necessarily, I mean, it's sort of taking responsibility, but if you don't care about, you can just give an explanation if you don't care about how the other person, like if you're not looking for a trust situation there or whatever, it's like, this is on the table. Well, I'm sorry, this is what happened. But I guess that's sort of an excuse too, because like you said, you're not taking responsibility there. It's just,
I can think of an example that all of us have heard. My dog ate my homework. Obviously an excuse.
True. Yeah, there was nothing I could have done about that. My dog, if you say I left my homework out where the dog could get it, and I shouldn't have done that, that's the explanation.
I wadded it up and put it in his mouth.
Yeah. But I think there still could be a neutral explanation. Like they're like, "Where's your homework?" Well, my dog ate it. And without any sort of, now I'm not saying this is a good thing or whatever, but it's not an excuse either if you don't care about it. Like if they asked you, what happened to your homework? And you're like, my dog ate it. And you don't expect that to excuse you of anything. It's still an explanation and not necessarily an excuse, because it could be either.
Well, I think it's an excuse because you're blameless in it. You're saying, I'm an innocent party. I think that's what makes it an excuse. You're excusing it. You're excusing what you did to cause this situation.
Well, yeah, I guess if you don't put what your actions were into it. But if you're not expecting to be excused or you don't care the outcome, it's still like if you're not doing it to actually excuse you from it, like you don't care about the circumstances around it, I think it's still an explanation. I think it's not a whole explanation, because you obviously were involved, like why was your homework out where the dog could get to it or whatever. But in this circumstances, if you don't care about whether you get a bad grade or whatever, then there's only one party involved in this and wants to know whether there's an excuse or not.
Yeah, I wonder, in what circumstances do we care whether we're giving excuses or explanations, or whether we're receiving excuses versus explanations?
That's why I think it comes back to what you're trying to get out of the conversation, whether you're trying to build trust or whether you feel like you need an excuse or not.
Okay, why would anyone ever need an excuse? Give me examples of why we need excuses.
For instance, with the homework one, their homework's missing and they care about whether they get a good grade or...
Okay, so the child cares if he gets a good grade?
They
or the
might.
Teacher cares that they made an assignment
the teacher
that's not being
both.
fulfilled.
That's what I'm saying. It's both. It's an understanding between the two of them. And if one side doesn't care, then and especially the one that the circumstances who have broken the expectation, then they're... I mean, I can see both as an excuse and as an explanation.
Okay, but why would you ask? Oh, it's not necessarily...
Why would you expect an excuse?
Why would a person ask why something happened?
Well, that's a good question, and something
about their behavior.
Yeah, That's something I had problems with getting that asked that question as a child. Now,
Yeah.
so you would think, because in good faith on both sides, that they would actually want to know whether there's an excuse or not for the bad behavior so that they could decide where their boundaries are and where they feel about whether punishment or pullback or whether they should enact the penalty of their agreement, whatever that is, if they had an understanding.
Let's unpack that. The first thing you indicated was that there's a bad behavior. How do we know behavior is bad?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it was a bad behavior, but a breaking of expectations. And bad behavior to me says I did something negligently or purposely. And so I think that's what you would be trying to figure out if you were wanting an excuse or an explanation.
And why do you want an explanation?
An explanation would be just to understand the circumstances around it, whether for curiosity purposes or understanding of a person. It wouldn't necessarily have to do with your relationship and your expectations. So, like I said, I think it has to do with whether there is a trust and a sort of whether explicit or unexplicit expectation between the two of you, between two parties.
So which situation do we want to use? What trusting relationship can we use as an example to try to parse this out?
A parent and a child.
Okay, parent and child. Right?
Okay.
Parent and child, maybe, is that easy enough?
Sure.
Is there trust that has to be there?
Right. And there's certain expectations between the parent and the child in lots of situations.
Does the parent have to explain things to the child at times?
Sure.
Like, what did you just tell him when you walked out about lunch, about food?
I went and got one of his siblings to help him.
So you found a resource for him.
Right.
Because he wasn't thinking that there are resources or other things I can use.
Right. I could have just told him to go look for food or whatever and do it himself. But I didn't have the expectation because he had already indicated to me that he didn't feel he was able to at the moment do it himself. So he came to me for help, and he didn't have the expectations for himself. He had already signaled that to me, and I didn't have the expectation that he was going to or wanted to or was going to be able to do it on his own, and so I went and got someone else to take care of the problem. But I also had an expectation that they would do it.
And apparently they did, right?
As far as I know, no one's come back up and said anything.
Right. It appears now that was successful.
He was very upset about not having food, and I'm pretty sure he would have come back up and said something if his sibling didn't help him with that. Because, again, there was an expectation that they would help him because I told them to.
So does expectation have a lot to do with explanations and excuses?
Yes, I think so. And I think expectation equals trust. How much we trust them to fulfill whatever we have talked about or whatever we have asked them to do.
So let's talk about setting expectations for other people. Let's do that real quick.
Okay.
I know that we can't control other people. And so when we set expectations for other people's behavior, then we're setting ourselves up for disappointment.
For sure.
And we're setting up the relationship to head towards undesirable, trust and feeling. Like it's not, we lose trust if someone breaks our expectations. So instead of expectations, you set boundaries. You'd say, if you do this, then this is what's going to happen, or this what's not going to happen anymore. I will do, what am I trying to say?
Whatever you're going to do with what you're comfortable to do, and take care of the situation for yourself.
Right. So you can, verbally say, I expect that you guys are all going to act like this while I'm doing this other thing. But that's unfair because you can't really control their thoughts and their feelings and their actions. And so what you can say is, if you do this, I mean, since we're talking about lunch and everything, if you tell them ahead of time, if you come into this room while I'm having a meeting, I'm just going to ignore you. And so just, you can see that's the boundary that I'm going to set up.
Right.
Or you can say, if it's really, really important, then you can come and get me. And then that way it leaves it up to them to decide, is this important enough that I'm going to come and get mom?
I think expectation, in the way that I'm using it, I see it as more as what my judgment on what their behavior is going to be, not as in, if they don't. So the boundary is if they don't live up to this expectation, it's what am I comfortable with dealing with that there? So it's a judgment to me of what do I expect them to do in this situation? And if they don't do it in that situation, how am I going to take care of the situation? And how much am I willing to trust, willing to give them in the situation according to their abilities or past experiences or whatever, in order to get the outcome from the situation that I need to happen? Or obviously stuff doesn't always go the same direction. And boundaries in that, obviously they have their own boundaries, and I have what I'm comfortable with, and they have what they're comfortable. Boundaries are actions in the situation and how we're going to deal with the situation that involves us. For instance, if you're going to yell at me, I'm going to get up and leave the room because I'm not comfortable with yelling. So it's your responsibility in the situation.
Yeah, you can't set expectations for, like, you just can't yell at me. You are not allowed to yell at me, but
they might.
I'm thinking expectation in what I expect to happen in the situation. Now, obviously, they have their own what they're going to do and stuff like that. And as far as setting expectations in the way I think you're saying it, which, I'm not saying that's wrong, but I understand your explanation of it, and how it's generally used. That's if you do this, I'm going to, if you don't do what I ask, this is what I expect you to do. That's an outward thing. This is what I expect you to do, and if you don't do it, you're going to get punished or whatever. So as far as I think about expectations, like I said, I think it's about what you expect in the situation and judging how much trust you can give somebody else, or trust them to do what you need to get done or whatever, versus the action, what I would consider more of an action. This is what you're going to do, and if you don't do it, this is what I expect you to do, as in this is my demands on the situation, rather than my judgment on the situation and the level of judgment, what I judge to be the level of trust I can expect from the situation. And I think that's a more personal expectations rather than, like I said, an action and putting it on someone else. I don't know. I think I got a little lost there in my explanation.
I think I heard her say, and I would like to change it to the word expectation and boundary, just take that away. There are certain things that an individual of any particular age can be expected to do. So like a 7-year-old and a 15-year-old have different jobs around the house, different responsibilities for one another, for their own belongings, for the way they treat you. They have to be trained and they have to get to a certain degree. So there are different expectations. But whenever a child is pushing that boundary, then they understand that there's going to be consequences. They're not doing, I have never, ever, even really young children, I've never seen someone do something really, really bad and not look a little bit guilty or behave like they did something wrong. I've seen 1-year-olds hit their baby and then lay down in the corner and put a blanket over themselves because they didn't, not their baby sister or brother, because they kind of had that innately. And then I think that's where like an excuse might come in. Well, she hit me with her hand, or she pinched my lip. That would still be an excuse in kind of a very basic level.
I think I have two thoughts on that, though. I think it depends on the child, because there's obviously different childs. I think generally you can expect things out of different age levels, but then there's circumstances, cognitive abilities and stuff that would cause it to be different. And I also don't know if I agree that it's 100% innate, because obviously, well, for instance, when was little and he has autism, he would hit me a lot all the time and laugh about it. And he had, even when I was yelled at him about it, didn't seem to have any, now obviously he has autism, but he didn't seem to have any ability to recognize innately that was wrong. Otherwise he would have hit me in the first place or laughed about it afterwards. And I think that maybe sometimes that something is bad is something that's taught because they've hit somebody and then somebody's yelled at them about it. Because I think as far as whether something's explicitly right and wrong, I think it's a cultural thing that's taught. Although we're taught when we hit somebody and they get upset, if you're able to recognize that, then that tells you that that's a bad thing because it causes harm to another person. But I don't know, I'd have to look at studies and stuff to see whether that's a thing that babies, a toddler, understand, whether it's nurture versus nature type thing.
Can I self
But that's sort of off.
I need to correct what I said. There is a development level at a developmental age, and some people meet it at 2 years old.
Yeah.
And some people are 16 before they're kind of thinking cognitively. But eventually they will.
I think
whether it's learned or
perhaps you're talking about maturity.
Right. Yeah.
Maturity sometimes never happens.
Right. And I think that goes back to knowing someone personally and gauging whether what level they're at and what from past experiences and conversations and stuff, whether you can trust them to fulfill what you're asking of them.
Okay, I see your level of trust is based on your expectations and the history you have with somebody, with a relationship. So a relationship has a time frame. In that time frame, you have trust. That trust and that expectation would then require an excuse. Let's use God. God knows us all more than we know ourselves, let's say. Does he have trust for us?
I'm sure he would trust us to whatever he feels our level of, If there's a relationship there and there's expectations, then there's trust of some kind.
And is there an expectation for every human on the earth from a God view?
I'm sure. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here
Okay. So where do we give our excuses or explanations to a supreme being, to God?
I don't think that there is a need for an excuse because he knows everything. So there's no...
Okay. And that's good. Why would God not need an excuse if we need excuses?
Well, it would have to come down to trust.
Well, maybe trust or omniscience. You identified he knows everything.
If we trust him 100% and that he knows everything, he wouldn't need an excuse.
Well, if we trust him, then that means that he's the one that would possibly need to give an excuse to us, an explanation as to why he killed these people or whatever.
Right, but trust goes both directions. If you fully trust somebody and that they're not going to do harm or break the agreement situation or whatever, then you don't need an excuse. You might want to understand the circumstance more and need an explanation or want an explanation, but you wouldn't need an excuse because you would trust that they did whatever they needed to do in good faith.
And so you wouldn't ask for an excuse or an explanation because you know them well enough, like yourself.
Right, but you might feel like you want an explanation in order to understand what happened in the person, but not necessarily need an explanation. Like you want to understand the situation better and what surrounded it to come to that, or the person better.
So out of curiosity, you might want to ask for an explanation.
Yes.
Or out of pain or desperation.
But pain.
Sometimes things happen and you just get on your knees and you ask Heavenly Father, why? And you rarely get an answer specifically, but you do get comfort and peace. You get like this understanding. And I wonder too if we have that with our own kids, because sometimes I don't address my children and sometimes I do. We're just having this conversation. One of my children lives in my house right now, and she doesn't think she needs to move right now. And I sort of think she does. Like, she needs to find a house and move. And so I have that huge expectation of her, but I didn't just blurt it out and say, well, why do you think you can live in my house forever? So this is something we will address before she hears this podcast.
That comes back to boundaries too, and it's expectations versus boundaries. You have your reasons for wanting your house back to yourself and all of that. And maybe you even have expectations for her.
I just kind of think I should ask her and let her explain.
Right. Well, explain whether she has a good enough excuse to stay in your house longer.
Yeah. That's what I mean.
Yeah, you would like an excuse from them, so you can judge whether you enact your boundaries or where your boundaries are in the situation, because you feel it's a negative situation that's impacting your boundaries or your life.
So the expectation, I've had an idea that expectations are the things that cause annoyances. You can be annoyed with something if you have an expectation. Do you have to be annoyed?
No.
Why? How can you not be annoyed in your life?
By accepting whether you have an expectation or not, accepting the outcome. So you would like something to happen this way, but if it doesn't, that's fine. You will do something else.
Right, because you know more. You know more. So if you lower your expectations is the idea, the concept, I believe, in order to not require. So that's why I wanted to try to introduce God. Try to introduce the highest supreme being you can think of that is not going to require an explanation from us. He gives us the opportunity to repent, but he doesn't say you have to go through this penance. That's some religions may come up with that penance is required, but God doesn't say you have to do that. He's saying, here's some commandments, here's what I expect, and he's not going to come down and damn you right now, I guess, for doing what you do, for living life.
So he knows everything.
And so do we.
But we don't know everything of every person, and I think that's where judgment, using your judgment, comes from.
Why don't we feel like we know enough about every person that we're having a relationship with?
Because we're not inside their mind.
Okay, and do you want to be inside their mind?
No, but that's what an excuse is about, is what was going on with you during this situation.
Okay, and why, in that situation, why would you care what was going on in their mind?
Because I want to understand them better so that I can...
Okay, understand first out of curiosity, perhaps. What's the other reason that you'd want to know what's going on in their mind?
Because if we're talking about where I felt there was a problem in the situation, it's to understand where I could put my expectations later on, and where I can try to plan and control a situation, which of course we can't have 100% control of the situation, but...
Is control important?
It is if you want a certain outcome.
Okay, so you said that earlier, outcomes. Is outcome really the only reason you would want an excuse? Is because the outcome isn't what you expected?
Right, because then, say in the situation where I got one of my children to help the other one make food, I need to know who's most likely to do that when I come down and ask them to do it, because right now I have the expectation that they did do it because they usually do. So I don't need to come down and make sure the situation happened.
So would that be your favorite child that you asked?
No. It depends on the situation and whether I feel like they're capable of doing it or not.
Okay, and so did you favored that child? You knew that child was likely to succeed in your request.
In that situation, yes.
In that situation, you had a favorite child.
So circumstances, she wasn't the first one I was going to ask. She was actually the third of the older children.
Right.
Because I had a lesser expectation of her fulfilling that. Now the other two were busy doing something else.
They weren't convenient. It wasn't convenient for them. It was convenient enough. There was
right.
Expectation that she could accomplish that task.
Right. And I could have tried to talk one of the other ones into doing it, but she was free and not doing anything. I mean, everyone's always doing something, but yeah, she was available. But if I had a lower expectation of her from previous situations, then I might try to talk one of the other ones into doing it if I felt like but that's also personal feelings between the two of us. If I felt like they weren't as busy to not be able to do that, because they may feel otherwise, but that's where negotiation and talking comes in.
What does control have to do with expectations and outcome? Outcome, control, expectations.
So obviously, when we set something in motion, we want a certain outcome. For instance, I wanted him to get fed, and without me doing it, because I'm in the middle of something else. So I want to figure out how to get the most, to set in motion things so that that's the most likely outcome. And so I'm going to see what I can do, what I can control, to get that outcome.
Okay, why did not do anything during that scenario?
Because I was asked, and because there was an expectation between the two of us, because he expected if he came to me and asked me, so it was an understanding and trust. If he came to me and told me his problem, that I would take care of it.
And he
for him.
didn't tell his grandmother.
No, because
about the problem.
Because they don't have that sort of situation. I mean, I guess if I wasn't here, for instance, one of kids came in early this morning, and she said her daughter said she was asleep, but I guess she wasn't. But anyhow, she came in and she told me that she wanted food, which I asked her, I helped her take care of that. Which she hadn't asked me for food before, but her mother, who she trusts to take care of that, she felt was unavailable. And so she found the next person she trusted to help with that situation.
Right. So there's a responsibility.
Right. But out of trust, because for him...
to control the situation.
Right.
Is the child also asking for control? They want to have a safe situation. He wants to have food. He wants to be safe. And he's asking for the responsible party to help.
Right. He's asking for me to control it because he feels out of control and like he can't control it.
So adding control is a good thing.
Right. As long as it's freely given, or if in the case of a child, it's my responsibility to make sure he doesn't die.
Right.
Because sometimes I have to take control.
And dying happens 3 or 4 days later, not
right.
10 minutes.
Right.
He's going to live for a little while.
Right.
So the expectation of an outcome is why you would require an explanation.
Right.
And if you're asking for an explanation of someone, why does it matter if it comes off as an excuse or an explanation? Why do you need to judge between excuse or explanation?
Well, like we said, it's because you're judging whether they could take responsibility or are taking responsibility or not. And then that tells you whether you can trust them in a similar situation or even other situations later.
So you're trying to control their future as well.
No, control your future, because you're trying to figure out what you can give or take from the situation to get the outcome that you either agreed upon or need. Because you can't control what they do, but you can try to, in order to have trust in them, try to figure out whether there's somebody that will uphold what they said they were going to do. And that's important when trying to, like if you said you were going to meet somebody somewhere and you show up and they never show up, and this is something they do constantly, now there can be an excuse for that too. because there can be situations that happen that make it so they can't show up ever. But if it's an ongoing thing and it's something they choose, then you know you can't meet up with them. But also, if it's an excuse, you know you can't meet up with them. So it's also, it's coming to an expectation of a conclusion of what you want out of a situation.
Okay.
And choosing what you're going to do about that, whether you're going to show up and just sit there and wait for them and hope that situation that happens that gives them an excuse doesn't happen, or whether you're just not going to do it because they're not very likely to do it in the first place, because they break that constantly because they just feel like it or whatever. So it's a setting of boundaries again, and what you feel like you're willing to do on your part and be okay with in the situation for the outcome you want.
I'm going to say there's a time whenever a mom might give an excuse where maybe she's sick or she's got a broken ankle, and the child comes to her and says, I need you to come out here and get the kitten out of the tree. And you just can't. And so you say, I really can't. That sounds like an explanation to me. I really can't go get that kitten out of the tree.
It is. It's an excuse and an explanation at the same time, I would think.
But with the description of which one is taking ownership and responsibility and which one is trying to blame this outside circumstance, blame your ankle.
Right.
With a broken ankle, you can climb a tree. Come on, Mom. You can climb a tree with a broken ankle.
Possibly. It depends on,
maybe not.
Depends on the person and the tree, I would say.
Right. And the mentality or the determination of the person.
Right.
If you need to climb the tree, your ankle won't matter at all. But if you're just annoyed that the kid asked you to get the cat out of the tree, it doesn't matter what the excuse is. Oh, we had chicken last night is just as good.
Right. But I would say that's a not in good faith excuse, and it's on the child again, whether they accept that or not. Now, accepting excuses or not really has to do whether they would trust their mom to come help with. And with children, that could be a big thing, and they don't trust you to help with a lot of other things later if they don't understand the circumstance. If you just said, we had chicken for dinner, because they wanted you to get a cat out of the tree. So, like I said, I think it has to do with building trust or whatever, because then they will lower their expectations of you being able to help them, at least in that circumstance, later.
And then maybe you could figure out a way where you didn't have to actually climb the tree with your broken ankle, or help them to figure out a way to get the kitten down.
Sure.
And so that, but anyway, But we rarely, as mothers, because there's two mothers sitting in this room.
Three. She's not in the room, but
we rarely, as mothers, just say no. We always try to figure it out. So we rarely say, I'm not going to do that for you. We do it even when we don't want to sometimes.
Yeah, I think though some mothers probably just say no sometimes, or like if you're feeling overwhelmed or whatever. But yes, you can give excuses that aren't actual excuses. I wouldn't say that was an excuse then, but you're using it as an excuse. But whether it's an excuse or whether it matters or whether it's true or not are three different things.
Well, I found another quote. I was looking for the original to see if it was Spencer W. Kimball. But Spencer W. Kimball said, any excuse for non-performance, no matter how valid, weakens your character. And I've been thinking about that for the last few minutes and listening. And I do believe that an excuse possibly could be negative. And maybe one of the scenarios that came up earlier was the parent asks for an explanation, and then they accuse the child of giving an excuse rather than an explanation. So I don't know if we have time, but it would be nice to kind of decide what Lisa said. Lisa already described it, but can you give an explanation and have it not be an excuse?
I would say for sure, but that also is subjective to the person involved, because they decided that your circumstances and the decisions you made in them were not an excuse. So it's a judgment from the other person. It was not good enough for them. They felt you could do something different or take responsibility in a different way.
Okay, so the person that gave the excuse, the supposed excuse, was it an excuse from their delivery? Did they deliver an excuse, or did they deliver an expectation?
Oh, they could believe that they felt like it was good enough, that they didn't need to take responsibility, and that
they
it was
could
good enough.
You're saying they could believe. I'm saying I would propose they absolutely believe that their explanation is accurate. From their perspective, from their point of view, that's the only thing they could have done. And they're telling you, this is the only thing I could have done. And then it's up to your judgment and your expectation and your possible annoyances that say, you could have done something else. That wasn't the only way to get the cat out of the tree.
If that's what they believe in, it's in good faith. If they're not giving, if they believe it's an actual excuse and they're not saying something just to excuse themselves.
I think that every person most likely is going to intentionally give an explanation, whether needed or not, or requested or not. And I'm talking more about adults and older children that have that cognitive ability. They're going to give an explanation. And I think now we're kind of going to where who's receiving that, who's listening to it, and how well they understand that person giving the explanation.
That's the trust thing again.
Yeah.
Trust and responsibility. I want to add the word responsibility there.
Correct. But they're judging whether you were responsible enough for the situation, whether they felt you were responsible enough, and whether the circumstances that you have given them. Now, I think the excuse is your intention is whether to, like I said, trust again and what you want out of the situation, whether you intend to sway them towards excusing you or not. Because if you just give an explanation in the situation and let them judge it either direction, because you can tell a story in many different ways. And if you word it in a way that, I'm sorry, this is what happened, like you should forgive me for this, rather than this is the situation that happened around the situation or leading up to the result. And you can decide what to do with that. So I think intent plays a big role, whether you intend it to be an excuse or not. Now, whether the other person takes it as an excuse, whether negatively, like you're trying to make an excuse and they feel like they're being manipulated, or not, or like you're trying to manipulate them, is another thing.
Spencer W. Kimball was a prophet, a director of lives and living, and saying this is the right way to live. His quote said, an excuse is never, can you say that again?
Maybe
you can find it again.
I can. An excuse for non-performance, no matter how valid, weakens your character.
Okay, so he's saying this is the way to good character. So we all want to have good character. We want to do things right. No matter what you do, no matter how valid the reason or explanation is, if you can term it as an excuse, so excuse for non-behavior, non-performance, is it possible to not perform? It's possible to make errors or mistakes or not perform.
Well, of course.
Yeah, so you're gonna have errors, you're gonna have mistakes. It's possible.
Right.
If you always blame someone else or make an excuse for it, an excuse for that, my ankle was hurting, or we had chicken last night. Any excuse decrease, and you're talking about that's the trust and the responsibility.
Mm-hmm. It
weakens your trust, weakens your character. Where can you use those excuses, though? I mean, there are circumstances that were around you non-performing. So if you didn't perform, is it valid for you to consider why you did not perform?
Sure.
And how do you do that?
It's important. It's important to consider whether, like she was talking about, responsibility, whether you are the one responsible for the outcome,
right,
or there were situations that caused it, whether you can make change or not to be able to perform what you needed to perform that you didn't in the future.
You need to change something for tomorrow, for the next 10 minutes, or, for your future. You need to learn from it. That's growth. That's the growth process, is identifying what occurred, And you're asking yourself that all the time. This isn't a thing, explanation and excuses, that you need to worry about your kids or your husband or your wife or, any relationship you have. Your relationship with yourself is primarily important in your explanations and your excuses.
Right.
If you can make sure that everything that you discuss in your non-performance is based on an explanation, this is what occurred and this is what I can learn from it. This is what I can move, what boundary I can put in place, maybe even.
Or what situation you can avoid or do something differently in, even if it wasn't something you negligently caused.
Right. Non-performance is just the outcome wasn't achieved, an expected outcome.
Yeah, the expectation, whether for yourself or between you and someone else, it was broken and wasn't achieved.
I have a thought. So we don't have to make it can be an excuse or an explanation,
Right.
Even if we don't give it to someone else. If it's only with us, if we're like, man, I didn't practice enough and I played terrible at church today, that's because I didn't practice enough, and that's kind of an excuse.
Or you could say it's because I didn't get enough sleep last night. Or you could blame all kinds of things as an excuse.
But you can say it to yourself. You don't have to say it to someone else to make it a valid excuse.
Unless they're generally curious. So the question then is an excuse manipulation? Like giving an excuse because you're trying to, and I think that's what I said before, you're trying to get a certain outcome from it. So, and is manipulation wrong in every situation? And I guess that depends on what you define manipulation as, because that comes back to trying to control a situation. But then again, giving an excuse trying to control the other person.
Or trying to control yourself.
But I think that would be more explanation then, because you leave it up to them. I think in giving an excuse, it's with you telling them, like said, responsibility-wise, that I had no responsibility for this. Don't look bad at me about this. Trust me more. As far as giving an explanation, this is what happened. This is how I was involved in it or wasn't involved in it. And just in good faith, just leaving it up to them to determine how they feel about it. I think an excuse then is more manipulation. It's like pleading with them to believe that you had no responsibility in it because that's how you want them to feel. And I think that's why parents get mad when they say you're giving me excuses. It's a signal that they're saying you're trying to manipulate me, which got confusing for me as a child, because I wouldn't say that was what I wasn't always trying to do, but more often than not, when they asked me why I did something, I would be trying to explain the situation rather than be like, I wasn't involved in this at all, I shouldn't be punished. And that got confusing for me, but I don't know if that's typical for all children.
I think you're going in the right direction with this idea of manipulation, and it seems to make sense that, well, anytime that you're trying to convince someone of your motives or your intent or how innocent you are in a situation, like you're trying to make them understand your point of view. I mean, I don't know if we would say manipulation, but the idea is that if you're giving them an excuse, you're trying to tell them that there was nothing you could have done about it. If you're giving them an explanation, then you're trying to tell them that this is what happened and here's the part that I played in it. But I think really overall, you've got to remember that you can't control what they're thinking about it, whether you're giving excuses or explanations.
Right.
Like they're going to see that. They're going to hear words out of your mouth and they're going to think something about that, and you have absolutely no control over that. Like you can use all of the best words in the world.
Right.
And it could still be it can be understood completely differently than how you were trying to convey it.
Yeah. I think that why we give excuses or how they get received goes back to trust, though, because if you don't trust them to judge what you said fairly because you want that outcome of them believing you and not being believing that you had no responsibility or whatever, then you would try to give them an excuse in order to try to persuade them more to your point of view. But if they trust you, they wouldn't need an excuse.
When we're talking about trust, we're kind of talking about shared experiences, and they know you, they know how you've been before. And I think while we're talking about this, we need to remember what we have control over and what we don't have control over. We ourselves, like I can control whether I'm perceiving that I'm giving an excuse or an explanation, but I can't control whether the person I'm giving these excuses and explanations to will see them as what I think that I'm giving them as.
Right.
And another thing I can't control is whether that other person is giving me excuses or explanations. I can't read their mind. I don't know if they consider what they're telling me is an excuse or if it's an explanation. I can't read their mind. I don't know. And so what I can control there is how I receive it. What I'm thinking, I'm hearing them say, my dog ate my homework, and I can receive that as an excuse or an explanation. And it doesn't matter what their intent was. I can give them grace and I can give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's what I have control over. I can't, if I try to place any responsibility for my thoughts on them, then I'm going about it all wrong. I can't tell them, well, you said that completely wrong, and so now I'm going to be mad at you, because they can't read my mind.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're the individual and you said something wrong, and there's a reason that you did it, you have an excuse for saying something wrong, for using foul language or whatever you said that was just incorrect. Are you upset with yourself?
That depends on whether you care about the other person or not.
No, it's just within you, just you. It's not even that other person.
You mean me in general?
Yeah. You, by yourself, in the middle of nowhere, decided to think something stupid.
I feel upset about stuff that I did that truly was out of my control, and it wouldn't be, as far as I can tell, avoidable.
Right. Some circumstance happens. You say something stupid, you yell at something, maybe just an animal. It's no relationship you're hurting, or a car on the road rage.
Well, I don't drive, but as far as getting I still get road rage or annoyed.
You get upset with other drivers.
I still am in the car and get annoyed sometimes. Do I get upset about my actions if nobody else was around? Is that what you're asking?
Correct. No one. You're not in a relationship with anyone else. It's just yourself.
Yeah, there wouldn't be an explanation or excuse there, because this is not between two people. I'm not needing to give that to anyone.
Okay, that's incorrect, I believe. I want to state that you do give yourself excuses and explanations all the time.
Well, if you're thinking about it and you're wondering why you did something, because whether you're curious or want to change circumstances, then yes.
Right. So if you're curious or if you're upset.
Right. I think some people just do stuff and don't care one way or another. Or like you said, I guess they feel like they're justified to themselves. So I guess I can see that.
But even justified to themselves, they're making an excuse or an explanation. I use these words that I speak because that's the only way I can get their attention. So I'm using these curse words because it attends people.
Well, if you're talking about
if you were alone,
you wouldn't be doing it to other people. But yeah, you do stuff alone that you justify. I mean, people in general do.
We need to identify if explanations or excuses are just in relationship to other people, or if that's ourselves too.
Oh, for sure.
I tried to bring that in from Spencer W Kimball, that an excuse is never valid. Can we say that? Is that a something that can be proven?
I would say we'd have to. I'm trying to think of what we decided an excuse was.
Blaming someone else.
It's not blaming,
not taking responsibility for yourself,
right?
Or whether you can take responsibility for it or not.
A doctor's excuse. Let's use a doctor's excuse. So if you have a test to take, or you're called to jury duty, but you've got a doctor's excuse. Can't serve on the jury because I've got this medical condition that I can't sit in a room for 3 hours or more. That's a valid use of an excuse. Is that a negative excuse or a positive excuse?
Well, it's a positive for you because the outcome would be negative if you didn't use the excuse.
Or maybe you really wanted to serve on the jury and the doctor is not going to allow you because you can't sit there that long.
Right. But it would still be negative for you, or at least he's deemed it's negative for you. The outcomes would be more negative than positive.
Outcomes, meaning whether you wanted to serve on the jury or whether you didn't want to serve on the
whether
jury.
it would, the whole situation would be a net positive or a net negative.
If you served and you were miserable
Yeah.
and you did harm to
Or you got
yourself,
sick or caused a problem for the
for the trial.
the trial, because you got sick and you couldn't be there and they had to switch in somebody else, or you die from sitting for blood clots from
Right.
sitting too long or something like that. So for you or for the trial, it's been judged a negative thing. But is that an excuse or an explanation why you're not doing it? It's used
they call
as
it
an excuse, called as an excuse. And that goes back to whether excuses are always negative and manipulation.
Is it possible to use an excuse and not manipulate?
I would say no, because you're still trying to control the situation. You want them to lean towards a certain way of thinking about you. Rather than just saying, these are the circumstances, you judge where your boundaries are and whether that's good enough for you.
What about persuasive speech then? If you just wanted to help convince somebody.
So that's still manipulation, because you're trying to persuade them. And that question is whether manipulation is always a bad thing.
Right.
I would say that's subjective, because when we're talking to someone, we're always trying to get them to, like said, understand from our perspective, which means we want them to understand why we think we're right.
Here's my one concept that I kind of wrote down earlier, that there are no excuses. I believe excuses don't exist. We don't give excuses. We give explanations. We only give facts based on our perspective. So that's how I framed that.
I agree with that, but you could also try to put facts in a more flattering light, or what you think would be more flattering light. It's like telling stories from different perspectives or in different ways. And obviously you can outright lie.
Yeah, or you could be giving half-truths, like you could be giving the facts. Everything you said was a fact, but it was half of it,
Right, leaving stuff out to make yourself look better. So I would say that excuses are manipulations, whether they're well-meant or otherwise. And it's the same thing if we're making an excuse to ourselves. We want to feel better about what we did, and we want to not have to make a change. In which case we're judging, was that an okay thing for me to do? Well, why was it an okay thing to do? And I would say if you're looking for an excuse rather than what was my responsibility in this situation, then you're trying to persuade yourself that it was okay. So you were trying to persuade and manipulate yourself to an outcome, or at least allow yourself to lean that direction.
So change would be the reason that some people would use excuses.
Or to not change.
To not change, to not want to change. What is it called when someone, you go through a debriefing? That's what I'm trying to think of, where you look at a situation and you identify, this is what I felt, how we did it, this is what all the facts that happened, and these are the decisions we made during that process, decisions that happened. So we just debriefed you, and the lunch, and hungry, and I need some food. So that was a debriefing. If you do that individually or with a group or with a relationship, you're doing that for the purpose of finding out what we could have changed, what we could have done differently, and how can we set that up for our future actions to be changed. And part of what you're talking about in that would be excuses. What are the excuses you have for not performing the way that we want to perform? There's excuses. There's possibly missed decisions, things that were done wrong, incorrectly. Mistakes that were made, things you didn't see that you weren't aware of that were a valid excuse. Not aware of that just hit me. All of that stuff is part of the debriefing scenario. You're only going to go to a debriefing if you actually want to change.
Right. So I think there's a difference between finding an excuse and making an excuse, as in you're looking for reasons why you don't It's your mindset, and whether you're looking at all the facts and saying this is what this was my fault or I had an effect on it, or whether you're looking for in what ways did circumstances happen to me, and kind of ignoring, like you're ignoring the other circumstances and your responsibility, because you always have some responsibility to a degree. So if you're looking for an excuse or to excuse yourself, I think it has to go back to the way you want the outcome to be, and wanting an outcome, a more positive outcome, because if you don't want to change, you don't want to see the negative aspect or what you would feel is negative and your responsibility for it. So finding excuses or things that can be excused because of situations is important, because that's you weighing and judging the situation. What was I responsible for? How did this happen? And I think it's the outcome, whether you want change, whether you don't want it to happen again. Because if you didn't have control over that, then you say, how can I avoid that? Because this is obviously what caused that outcome. And what can I do myself to avoid that situation altogether? And what came into play with that? Your actions and the other situations. So I think it's mindset of whether you're looking to make an excuse or give an excuse, and whether the difference between making an excuse and actually having something that is an excuse.
Well, if you're going to give an explanation, you're not necessarily going to make the excuse. The excuse is something that's kind of like a knee-jerk reaction. If you're going to make an excuse or make up an excuse.
Right. Well, but like
that's
you
a reaction.
said, there's things that would legitimately excuse your responsibility as far as that part of the situation.
Well, and if it's something that you weren't aware of, that you say that outside circumstance I wasn't aware of, and it surprised us. And when it surprised us, we made the wrong decision. But you can say, what can we do now to pay attention to that, be more circumspect, and understand what may have come from that direction?
Right. That's what I'm saying. That's very important too.
So
if you're looking for change.
Your actions.
But this is all coming down to trying to get a certain outcome because we want better situations.
Well, improvement, becoming a better person all the time. Is that the outcome?
Well, it depends. That's for personal stuff. But as like I said, like meeting up with somebody, if you actually want to meet up with them, you're going to, whether it's your fault they're not meeting up with you, or their fault, you're going to have to figure out where that lies with you and what you can change. Or you are going to decide that meeting up with them is not something that's either feasible or a good thing in your life. But yeah, as far as personal change, but that goes down to relationships. But as far as personally, it's important to figure out what you can control and what you were responsible for.
Taking responsibility.
Right.
You're either responsible for everything or not responsible for everything, and either position can be validly argued.
True, but it has to do with what the outcome you want is. Because if you're not responsible for anything, then you might as well not plan or have any control whatsoever towards the act.
And then you can blame everybody else for everything, including God. This is why it happens, and it's not my fault. And you end up not doing anything.
Right.
There's no constructive progress.
Or making your life any better.
So that's why it is your individual life. No matter what you look at, it's your individual progress, even with every relationship and every other situation in your life.
Because that's all you can control and all you can be responsible for.
Right. And if you determine, let's just say, for instance, you determine that you don't want to be responsible for your life, you know it's everyone else's fault, and there's always an excuse. You're not going to be at meetups. You're not going to make it. You won't be here at 1:00 for a phone call. It's just not going to happen.
Or maybe it will happen, but if it doesn't happen, then there's nothing to do about it.
And do we get upset?
Yeah, I know lots of people that have that mindset.
Yeah, and do we have a right? Do we have a right to get upset at those people who have that mindset?
Do we have a right to get upset with them? I think that has to do with where our boundaries are and how we feel about it. It can be frustrating for sure, but I think getting upset with them is a choice because it has to do with, I care about these people. I can't control them, so it has to do with how much of their attitude or perspective on life comes in contact with mine and how it's going to cause problems with mine. Would I like to help them and help them have a happier life? Sure. All I can do is try to talk to them and change their perspective. But I'm not going to get maybe frustrated to some degree, but that has to do with expectations. I'm not going to get upset with them unless that causes problems with what I'm trying to accomplish, whether happiness or safety or just goals in general for myself and for those I have responsibility for, to whatever degree. Like my children, I have responsibility for them to a certain degree, and that has to do with certain actions they take. It's not a control thing. If they take certain actions, I have to take the responsibility for that and fix the situation.
But they need to be taught to take responsibility for themselves.
Right. Well, that's part of raising your kids, is helping them to figure out how to take responsibility for themselves.
So I'm hearing that every individual should, for the most part, take responsibility for things.
Full responsibility,
and not be giving excuses why they didn't because somebody else was. That happened to me because of God, or because of the way I was raised, or because I don't have any money, or because my car broke down. All those things happen to us, or we've had those feelings, but we should also say, well, I probably could have called my sister and got a ride. And whether God gives me the good cards or not, I can still get up in the morning and get dressed and behave appropriately and make myself better. So I really think we shouldn't make excuses now. I'm starting to feel like people that make excuses maybe are destroying their own character with each excuse they make. And whether you make it to yourself or to someone else. And I remember being about 19, no, I was older than that, 29, let me just say, when I felt old, when I started feeling like a mature adult, that was about 29. But I remember clearly recognizing that I was telling people, well, I would have done that, but my kids kept me busy, or I would have done that, but I didn't get a chance to take a shower this morning. And so I just missed that meeting because I couldn't. And there were just things that I was blaming everything on something else or a circumstance and not myself, or even other people. I mean, my neighbors, they just never come over and they never pick up their yard, and it makes weeds grow in my yard, and their trash is blown into my yard. I was blaming it on something else and not on myself. I could have gone out and picked up the trash in my yard, even if it blew from their house.
Or talked to them.
But I was always acting like it was their fault that my yard was messy, or my kids' fault that I didn't get a shower. It wasn't their fault. I could have made arrangements in my own life to get that done. And eventually I realized, wow, it's not all on them, it's on me. And so an explanation would be, I didn't get up early enough to get my shower. I didn't pick up my yard, and now it looks like a giant trash mess. Instead of saying it was my neighbors or my children. But that explanation would only be given to myself, usually. Maybe my spouse.
I think what you would say to them is, I didn't come, if you're being honest, I didn't do that because I didn't want to. I had something else I wanted to do instead. And that has to do with priorities and what you choose as priorities. What you're saying is, I didn't prioritize that. And the reason why you didn't prioritize that is subjective to whether you felt it was more important or not than something else. So rather than an excuse, you would be being honest on why you didn't do it when taking personal responsibility.
I think that's if the reason is actually that I didn't want to do it.
Right.
I mean, be honest with it.
Right. Well, I mean, you may have wanted to do it, but there may have been something else that you felt was more important to do, though.
Yeah.
And I think there are situations where stuff does happen, like you got hit in the car by a car and you're in the hospital.
Yeah. There's a third option to giving an excuse or an explanation. You could give nothing. You could just say nothing. You could just say, I won't be there.
Right.
I can't do that. You can just leave it as that.
Well, I can't do that is an explanation or an excuse, because you're saying their circumstances, whether you're giving them, but just say, no, I'm not doing that. That's a choice rather than an explanation or an excuse. And I don't think you owe that to everyone, whether they're curious or think they need one.
I've heard that if you use fewer words, people think you're wise. If you try to explain it all out, they have different thoughts about what you said. But if you just say, I am not able to be there, or call them up and say, not coming today, sorry, click, then they just have to wonder or assume that you really have a good reason or you would be there.
Well, but that's also setting a firm boundary. It means I'm not trying to persuade you either direction. This is what I've chosen for myself. And where you come into it, whether I respect you or love you or not, does not come into this because I'm not willing to change my mind. This is what I've decided.
It's all subjective too and situational. If there's a meeting you're supposed to be at or a group you're supposed to be leading something or do something, and you just don't show up, you don't have to give an excuse or an explanation. You don't have to let them know.
But that comes to wanting an outcome. If you don't care about being fired and you're okay with that outcome, then you're not going to say anything. But if you want not to get fired, whether you got hit by a car or you just decided to sleep in, you're going to say something because the most likely outcome is they're going to fire you.
Yeah, for a work environment, you'd have to call in a sick day. But let's say you call in a sick day, you send a text, I'm sick today.
There's expectation and trust there.
Yeah, you're allowed certain abilities to have a personal life.
Right. But there's an agreement there. You've already agreed that you would come in by the contract you signed, and there's an expectation there. Now, when somebody just asked you, hey, will you come do this? Now, if it's within your job scope, there's an expectation that you're going to say yes. But if it's just a personal thing and you're like, will you come to this get together we're having?
Right.
Then there's
or
no
let's just say that
expectation. Well, even if they want
say
you
that
there.
It's church. If you say, I'm going to go to church and you don't go to church, no one's going to ask you. There's no expectation that you're really going to be there.
Unless you usually go to church and you just don't show up, and then they might call you to try to figure out because they expected you to come and they're worried that something might have happened.
Yeah. And usually what happens is no one calls, which is just fine. That's standard. No one calls. You weren't there. They just noticed you weren't there. I mean, we had to get someone else to play the organ this week.
I've had people show up at my house afterwards, but
and ask you, where were you?
Yes,
you're more special than us.
Yeah, I guess I'm not saying that's a general thing, but I'm saying in my experience, I've had people show up after church to find out why it wasn't there.
Yeah, see if you were sick or there's some reason, some excuse that you had that we can help you with.
Or they said later, because I did. Now this is sort of off topic, but I had had one of my kids, and we usually stay home for a month until we start going out to places and stuff. And I had explained that beforehand, but they didn't understand or whatever beforehand. And then or afterwards, and they showed up and they're like, well, we noticed she hasn't been at church for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
this is a family plan. It's just our idea.
That wasn't an excuse because they could take that whether they thought it was justified or not. It was a decision and an explanation.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we may have run out of time. Can you wrap it up?
So here's what I propose as the minute. And I think you already said it. Maybe you said it before. 100% responsibility. There's no reason to make excuses, or I don't know that anyone really does make an excuse. They're trying to give their explanation based on their perspective. And as long as they take responsibility for that, you don't have to view them poorly or judge them poorly.
No. Yes, I mean, I think as far as personal goes, that it's important to not make excuses and to if you want progress and better outcomes, whether that's being better yourself or a better situation, it's important to not look for excuses and to try to view the situation as non-biased as you can to try to figure out what you can control and what you can change about yourself to have better outcomes. and that it's important because of people's emotional intelligence and the personal responsibility they're willing or can take for themselves, not to judge them poorly or get annoyed by them, but to figure out what they're most likely to take responsibility for and how you can interact with them in that way, and how you're willing to interact with them in that way, what you're willing to accept as far as outcomes for your relationship or the situations you're in, rather than just be upset with them all the time, because you can't control that.
Okay. No, that's good. Be responsible. Excuses are not necessary.
Right.
Change is necessary. If we look for change, you won't have to use an excuse.
Right.
Good.